Welcome to Late Night Explainer. Settle in. Let the lights go low, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and let the day you've been carrying slide off your back and onto the floor where it can wait until morning. There's nothing left for you to do tonight. Nothing to solve, nothing to fix, nothing to remember. Just a story, told slowly in a calm and even voice, for as long as you'd like to listen. And if you drift off somewhere in the middle of it, that's not a failure. That's the whole point. You're allowed to leave before the ending will keep. Tonight, we're going to tell the entire story of a company. Not a small one, not an ordinary one. We're going to tell the story of what was, in many ways, the first global corporation the world had ever seen. A company that grew so large it stopped being a company at all and became something stranger. A thing that owned ships and forts and armies, that minted its own coins, that signed treaties with kings, that fought wars in faraway seas, and that, for nearly 2 centuries, threaded itself through the whole of the known world like a single, long route, reaching from the canals of Amsterdam to the harbours of Japan. We're going to begin at the beginning with a charter signed on a spring day in 1602, and we're going to follow that long route all the way to its quiet, corrupted death in the last hour of the last day of 1799, the whole arc, slowly, with time to breathe. But before we go back to the beginning, let me tell you about a trade, a swap, one of the strangest deals in all of history, and the kind of thing that once you've heard it, you turn over in your mind for a long time afterward, the way you might turn a smooth stone in your pocket. In the year 1667, 2 exhausted naval powers, the English and the Dutch, sat down to end a war, and they signed an agreement called the Treaty of Breda. As part of that treaty, they tidied up their possessions scattered across the oceans of the world. They traded islands the way you might trade cards across a table. And in one of those exchanges, the English agreed to give up their claim to a tiny island in the Far East Indies. An island so small you could walk its length in an afternoon. An island called Run, just a few city blocks of land surrounded by warm sea. In return, the Dutch agreed to give up their claim to an island on the other side of the world, an island in North America that they had been holding, an island the English already occupied. That second island was called Manhattan. Let that settle for a moment. The Dutch, in 1667, let go of Manhattan, the future New York, the future capital of capital, the island of skyscrapers that hadn't been dreamed of yet. And in exchange, they kept hold of a speck in the Indian Ocean called Run. And here is the part that's hard to believe from where we sit tonight, with the noise of the modern world all around us. At the time, both sides walked away from that table, feeling they had gotten the better end of the deal. The Dutch were quietly delighted. They had wanted Run far more than they had ever wanted Manhattan, because Run grew nutmeg. And in 1667, a tiny island that grew nutmeg was worth more, in the cold arithmetic of the men who ran the world's first global corporation, than the future site of New York City. How could that possibly be? How does a handful of trees on a forgotten island outweigh Manhattan? We'll get there. That's one of the threads we'll follow tonight, and we'll come back to that swap much later, once you understand why a single nutmeg could be worth hundreds of times its weight, and why men were willing to do terrible things to control where it grew. For now, just hold the image. A few trees traded for New York, and remember that the company at the heart of that strange decision is the company whose whole life we're going to walk through tonight, from its first breath to its last. So let us rewind, let us go back, away from 1667, back across decades, to a flat and watery little country on the edge of the North Sea in the very first years of the 17th century. Let the warm sea of Run fade out and let the cold grey water of the Dutch Republic fade in. The canals, the windmills turning slowly against a pale sky, the merchant ships crowding the harbours of a young nation that had only recently torn itself free from the rule of Spain and was still, in many ways, fighting for its life. This is where our company is born, not in a palace, in a place of merchants and ledgers and weather. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently, the way you'd ask a friend in the dark. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? I find myself genuinely curious about that. The cities and the small towns and the quiet rooms scattered all over the globe where someone is lying in the dark with this voice in their ear. If you feel like it, leave a word in the comments below and tell me where you are. There's something comforting in knowing we're a scattered little company of our own, all drifting towards sleep together. And if you're new here and you'd like more long, slow stories like this one to carry you off to sleep, you might quietly subscribe before you fade out. No rush. The button will still be there in the morning. Now, back to the water and the merchants and the year 1602. In those years, the Dutch had discovered something intoxicating and dangerous. They had discovered the spice trade. Ships were sailing out of Dutch ports down past Africa, around the bottom of the world, and into the warm waters of the East Indies. And they were coming back, the ones that came back, loaded with pepper and nutmeg and cloves and mace, the precious dried bits of faraway plants that Europe craved with an almost feverish hunger. And these voyages, when they succeeded, made fortunes. A single successful return could turn a modest merchant into a wealthy man. The whole country could smell the money on the wind. But there was a problem, and it was the kind of problem that quietly eats a fortune from the inside. There wasn't one Dutch trading enterprise. There were many. Several separate little companies had sprung up in different Dutch towns. They were called the Voorcompagnieën, which simply means the pre-companies, the companies that came before. And these pre-companies were all chasing the same thing, all sailing to the same distant islands, all trying to buy the same spices from the same growers and sell them in the same markets back home. Picture what that does when several Dutch buyers all arrive at the same little spice island, eager and competing. What happens to the price the local growers can charge? It goes up. The Dutch buyers, bidding against each other, drive the purchase price up. And then those same Dutch merchants sail home, all arriving in Europe with holds full of the same spice at the same time, all desperate to sell. And what happens to the selling price? It goes down. They flood their own market and undercut each other. So the Dutch were doing the worst possible thing. They were competing against themselves on both ends of the world at once, paying too much in Asia, earning too little in Europe, and squeezing their own profits to nothing in the gap between. It's a little like a family where everyone is trying to buy bread from the same baker and sell bread to the same neighbor, all on the same morning, all elbowing each other in the doorway. Nobody wins. The baker laughs and the neighbor pays whatever he likes, and the family goes home with empty pockets, having worked very hard for nothing. Into this muddle stepped a statesman, a careful, formidable, immensely capable man named Johan van Oldenbarnevelt. He was one of the leading political figures of the young Dutch Republic, the kind of patient, calculating mind that sees a tangle of competing interests and quietly works out how to braid them into a single rope. And he understood the problem perfectly. As long as the Dutch traders kept bidding each other's prices up in Asia and down in Europe, they would never be strong enough to face their real rivals. The Portuguese, who had been in those eastern seas for a century, and now the English, who had founded their own East India Company just 2 years earlier, in 1600. So Van Oldenbarnevelt set himself to a difficult, delicate task, getting all those proud, prickly, independent Dutch pre-companies scattered across rival towns that didn't much like each other, to fold themselves into a single shared enterprise, to stop competing, to merge. It was a piece of political stitching that took real skill, because each town wanted its own share of the glory and the profit, and none of them wanted to be swallowed by Amsterdam, which was already the biggest and the richest and inclined to throw its weight around. And on the 20th of March in the year 1602, the stitching was finished. The governing body of the Dutch Republic, an assembly known as the States General, which was in essence the parliament of the new nation, issued a charter, a founding document. And with that charter, all those squabbling pre-companies dissolved into one. The new entity that rose in their place had a long and stately name, the Vereenigde Oostindische Compagnie. In English, the United East India Company. United, because that was the whole point, the uniting of the rivals. But across the centuries it has come to be known by just three letters that would be stamped onto coins and cannon and the sterns of 1,000 ships, the V, the O, and the C, the VOC. Now, when you and I hear the word company tonight, we picture something fairly tame, an office, a logo, a thing that makes a product or offers a service and answers, in the end, to the laws of the country it lives in. But the charter that the States General handed the VOC in 1602 was nothing like that. It granted this brand new company powers so vast and so strange that we struggle to find words for them now. This was not a company in any sense you've ever met. This was a company that was given on paper many of the powers of a nation. First, and most simply, the charter handed the VOC a monopoly. For 21 years, the VOC and the VOC alone would be permitted to carry on Dutch trade across an enormous arc of the planet. The charter drew this region with two great landmarks at its edges. On the western boundary, the Cape of Good Hope, the rocky tip at the bottom of Africa, the gateway from the Atlantic into the Indian Ocean. On the eastern boundary, the Strait of Magellan in that storm-lashed passage at the very bottom of South America. Everything in between, all the trade east of the Cape and west of the Strait of Magellan, which is to say, essentially, the entire span of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, half the surface of the world, was handed to a single company as its private trading preserve. No other Dutchman could lawfully sail into that vast region to trade. It belonged, by decree, to the VOC. But a monopoly was only the beginning, because the charter went much, much further. It granted the VOC what we can only call quasi-sovereign powers, the powers that before and since have belonged almost exclusively to states, to kings, to governments. The VOC was given the right to wage war, an actual private right written into its founding document to raise armies and fight battles in Asia in the company's own name. It was given the right to conclude treaties, to sit down with foreign rulers, with sultans and kings and emperors on the far side of the world, and to negotiate and sign binding agreements as though it were itself a nation among nations. It was given the right to build forts, to construct its own fortifications, its own strongholds, its own walled and cannoned outposts wherever it judged them needed. It was given the right to coin money and mint its own currency for use in its eastern domains, and it was given the right to administer justice, to set up its own courts, to try people, to pass judgment, to punish. Sit with that for a moment in the dark, slowly. A war-making, treaty-signing, fort-building, money-minting, justice-dealing company. Every one of those powers is something we now think of as belonging only to a government. We don't let the corner shop declare war. We don't let a chain of stores sign treaties with foreign nations or mint its own coins or run its own prisons. And yet here, at the dawn of the 17th century, a republic of merchants handed exactly those powers to a private trading company and signed the document and considered it sensible. because the distances were so vast and the voyages so long that the men in Amsterdam knew they could never govern events on the far side of the world from their desks. By the time a question sailed home and an answer sailed back, 2 years might pass. So they gave the company the power to be a government unto itself, out there in the East, beyond the reach of any law but its own. This is the first great thread of our story, and I want you to hold on to it as you drift, because we'll feel its weight again and again before the night is through. How can a private company be allowed its own army, the right to wage its own wars? You've just heard the answer, because a parliament wrote it down and signed it on the 20th of March, 1602. And everything that the VOC would later do, every fort it raised, every treaty it forced, every island it conquered, and yes, every terrible thing done in the pursuit of a tree that grew nutmeg, all of it traces back to those few lines of ink in that founding charter. The violence and the glory were both written in from the start. They were never separate. They were the same grant of power seen from two sides. Now, a company with the power to wage wars and build forts on the far side of the world needs more than a charter. It needs to be run by someone, and it needs to be run carefully, because the temptations and the distances are enormous. So how was the VOC actually governed? Who sat at the top of this strange new creature? At the very head of the company sat a board of 17 men, 17 directors, who met to set the grand policy of the whole enterprise, where to send the fleets, how much to spend, what to build, whom to fight. And these 17 men were known, plainly and a little grandly, as the Heren 17, the Lords 17. Whenever you hear that phrase tonight, the Heren 17, the Lord 17, picture 17 sober merchants in dark clothing around a long table, debating the fate of distant oceans by candlelight, men who in many cases had never seen and never would see the islands whose lives they were ordering from 1,000 leagues away. But here's a detail that tells you something important about how the Dutch put their country together. Those 17 directors weren't drawn from one place. They came from 6 different regional chambers, 6 local branches of the company, rooted in 6 different Dutch towns, each one a survivor of the old pre-companies that had been stitched together. There was the Chamber of Amsterdam, the great and wealthy heart of the whole thing. There was the Chamber of Zeeland, based in the town of Middelburg, down in the watery southwest. There were the chambers of the smaller ports, Delft and Rotterdam and Hoorn and Enkhuizen, each a proud little maritime town with its own merchants and its own ships and its own stubborn sense of importance. 6 chambers then: Amsterdam, Zeeland at Middelburg, Delft, Rotterdam, Hoorn and Enkhuizen. And here is where you can feel the old rivalries still alive inside the new company, like a knot you can see beneath the smooth surface of a rope. The seats on that board of 17 were not shared out equally. Amsterdam, being by far the largest and richest of the chambers, claimed 8 of the 17 votes, 8 out of 17. Which means that on any given decision, Amsterdam sat just 1 vote short of an outright majority all by itself. The other 5 chambers together held the rest, and they had to band together if they ever wished to overrule the giant in their midst. It was a careful, slightly uneasy balance, Amsterdam dominant but not quite absolute. The smaller towns kept just relevant enough to stay loyal. You can imagine the quiet tensions in that room, the way the Amsterdam men spoke a little more loudly, the way the men from Hoorn and Enkhuizen watched them and counted votes. The whole machinery of the world's first global corporation balanced on that one missing 17th vote. Now we come to money. Because to do any of this, to build the ships, to crew them, to buy the spices, to raise the forts, to pay the soldiers. The VOC needed a staggering amount of capital up front, and the way it raised that capital is the second great thread of our story, the thread that runs through the world of finance, and it is, in its own quiet way, every bit as world-changing as the army and the treaties. Because the VOC didn't just become a country, it also, in those same early years, became something we still live inside today. It became the ancestor of the modern stock market. When the company was founded in 1602, it gathered together an initial pool of capital, money subscribed by its investors, that came to roughly 6.5 million guilders. 6.4 million guilders, to be more exact. Now, a guilder is an old Dutch coin, and the number alone means little to us tonight. So let me give you the feeling of it instead. This was, for its time and place, a colossal sum, an almost unheard of amount of money to gather into a single enterprise. To grasp just how large it was, set it beside the company's great rival across the sea. The English had founded their own East India Company 2 years earlier, in 1600. The English East India Company, the EIC as it's known, and the English Company, in those early years, did things the old way. It funded its voyages one at a time. When the English wanted to send a fleet east, they would raise money for that particular voyage, send the ships, wait for them to return, sell the cargo, divide up the proceeds among the backers of that one voyage, and then, and this is the key, close the books on it. Each voyage was its own little temporary venture, raised and settled and wound up, one after another, like a series of separate small bonfires lit and allowed to burn out. The Dutch did something different, something new. And it is in that difference that the whole future of finance was quietly born. The 6.5 million guilders that the VOC raised in 1602 was not gathered for a single voyage, to be divided and dissolved when those ships came home. It was raised as what we would now call permanent capital. The money was locked in. It was committed to the company for a long initial term, 10 years before any thought of giving it back. And in practice, it would stay invested far longer than that, rolling forward year after year, voyage after voyage, decade after decade. The investors put their money in, and that money did not come back to them at the end of a single trip. It became the lasting body of the company itself, the permanent foundation on which everything else was built. This sounds like a small, dry, technical thing, a detail for accountants, but I want you to understand slowly why it was a revolution, because almost everything that came after rests upon it. When you fund a voyage one at a time, your company is really just a temporary agreement among a few people that ends when the ships come home. It can't plan for the long term. It can't build a permanent fort knowing the fort will still be useful in 30 years because the company itself won't exist in 30 years, and it'll have been wound up and reborn a dozen times over. But when the capital is permanent, when the money stays in and the company simply continues year after year, then suddenly the enterprise can think in decades. It can build forts that will stand for a generation. It can plant gardens that take years to fruit. It can lay siege to a problem patiently, the way only something that expects to outlive its founders can. The permanent company can do what no temporary voyage ever could. It can become a lasting institution. It can, in time, become an empire. And there was a second consequence of locking the money in, a consequence that nobody quite intended and that would change the world even more than the first. If your money is locked into the company for 10 years, but life is uncertain, if you fall ill, or your fortunes change, or you simply decide you'd rather have your money back, what do? You can't go to the company and demand your share because it's locked in. The company won't give it back to you, and so there was only one thing you could do. You had to find another person, somewhere out in the world, who was willing to take your place, to buy your share from you, to step into your shoes as an owner of a slice of the company. You sold your stake to a stranger. And that stranger now owned what you had owned. And the moment that became possible, and the moment shares in the company could be passed from hand to hand, from one owner to the next, for whatever price the two of them could agree on, something entirely new came into being in the world. A market. A continuous living market in the ownership of a single company. Not a one-time sale, but an ongoing trade, day after day, as shares changed hands again and again, the price rising and falling with the news and the rumors and the moods of the men doing the buying and selling. For the first time in human history, you could own a piece of a great enterprise, and you could sell that piece whenever you liked to, whoever would have it, at a price that floated and shifted from one day to the next. The whole strange, restless world of the stock market, and the thing that hums beneath so much of modern life, began here, in this small and practical solution to a simple problem. The money's locked in for 10 years, so how do you get out? You sell your share to someone else. And in answering that one quiet question, the Dutch lit a fire that has never gone out. We'll follow that fire much further as the night goes on. We'll meet the marketplace where those shares were traded, and the men who learned to bet against the company and profit when its price fell, inventing, in the process, tricks of finance we still use and still fear today. We'll find the oldest surviving share certificate in all the world, a piece of paper from the early days with a name still legible on it. We'll learn how the company first paid its owners their profits and why those first payments came not in gold or silver, but, astonishingly, in spice, in the very nutmeg tree product that men were dying for on the far side of the world. The money story and the blood story are the same story. They always were. Every glittering financial first that the VOC invented sat beside a physical cost paid out somewhere on a distant island by people who never saw a guilder of the profit. But all of that is still ahead of us. For now, let it be enough to hold these first things gently in your mind as you sink deeper into the pillow. A spring day in 1602, a charter signed by the States General of the young Dutch Republic. A statesman named Johan van Oldenbarnevelt patiently stitching the squabbling pre-companies together so the Dutch would stop bidding their own prices up and down across the world. A new company with a long name and 3 famous letters, the Volkie, a grant of powers so vast it could wage war, sign treaties, raise forts, mint coins, and judge the living and the guilty, all on its own authority, across half the surface of the earth, from the Cape of Good Hope to the Strait of Magellan. 17 sober directors, the Lords. 17 ruling from 6 chambers in 6 Dutch towns, with Amsterdam holding 8 of the 17 votes, 1 short of supreme command, and 6.5 million guilders of permanent capital locked in, refusing to be returned, and in that refusal accidentally giving birth to the tradable share, the floating price, and the long restless life of the stock market. A company that was, from its very first day, 2 things at once: a nation in the shape of a business, and a business in the shape of a nation. The 2 faces have not yet come apart, and they never will. That is the truth at the center of this whole long story, and we'll feel it pressing closer as the night deepens. That the wealth and the cruelty were not separate chapters in the life of this company. They were the same fact, seen from 2 sides. The same charter that promised dividends to maids and servants in Amsterdam also promised forts and cannon and conquest in the islands of the East. The money and the violence were poured from the same cup. And out there, far beyond the cold canals of Amsterdam, in a chain of small green islands ringed by warm and shining sea, the trees were already growing. The nutmeg trees and the clove trees, heavy with the fruit that all of Europe craved. They didn't yet know what was coming for them, those islands. They didn't yet know about the Charter or the Lord 17 or the locked-in millions or the long ships even now being fitted out in Dutch harbours and pointed toward the rising sun. They only knew the rhythm they had always known, the rains, the harvests, the old trade of small boats moving spice from island to island, as their grandparents and great-grandparents had done before them. That world had perhaps a few years left, will sail toward it slowly. But not tonight, not yet. For now, let the islands stay green and untouched in the dark of your mind, and let the ships stay at anchor in their cold northern harbours, sails furled, waiting. We have only just signed the Charter. There is so much still to come, and all of it can wait until you're ready for it. And so the story turns now toward money. Not the idea of money in the abstract, not the simple exchange of coin for goods across a market table, but something stranger and more durable than that. The invention of a kind of ownership that could be bought and sold and held and traded, that could outlive any single voyage, any single captain, any single season of winds and storms and luck. What the Vereenigde Oostindische Compagnie built in the first years of its life, almost as a practical necessity rather than a grand design, was something the world had never quite had before. And because it was built out of necessity, it had a solidity that purely theoretical inventions often lack. It solved a real problem. It answered a genuine question. And in answering it, it changed the shape of commerce so completely that we still live inside the answer today, 4 centuries later, mostly without noticing it. The problem at its heart was this. Trade with Asia was not like trade across the North Sea, or down the Rhine, or even to the ports of the Mediterranean. It was not a matter of loading a cart in the morning and returning with coin by evening. A voyage to the Maluku Islands, to the Banda Sea, to the pepper markets of India consumed a year, 18 months, sometimes more. Ships left Dutch harbours in winter or spring, rode the trade winds south along the coast of Africa, rounded the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, and pushed on through months of open water before they touched the shores of Asia. And then they had to come back. The whole round journey, if it went well, if storms did not scatter the fleet and disease did not empty the holds of the men needed to sail her home, might take 2 years, might take 3. The English East India Company, founded in 1600, 2 years before the VOC received its charter, had operated in what seemed the natural way. Merchants gathered their money for a specific voyage, pooled it, dispatched the ships, and when the ships came home and the spices were sold, the profits were divided and the partnership dissolved. For that voyage, done. For the next voyage, you raised new money again, built new partnerships, negotiated new terms. It was familiar, comprehensible, and it matched the shape of how people had always thought about trade and risk. You put your money in, you waited, you got your money back, plus profit if fortune had been kind, and then the arrangement was over. But there was a deep inefficiency in this, and the men who designed the VOC saw it clearly. If every voyage was a separate subscription, then the capital you had carefully assembled at great cost could not be put to work continuously. The ships returned, the money was paid out, the next expedition had to start the process of raising funds all over again. And in the meantime, what? The forts you had built in Asia, the relationships you had cultivated with local rulers, the knowledge you had bought at such cost in time and lives and treasure, all of it sat idle, waiting for the merchants to agree on terms again. It was like building a road, using it once, and then tearing it up to sell the stones. The VOC's solution was what its architects called permanent capital. The money subscribed in 1602 would not be paid out after the first voyage, nor after the second, nor after the 5th. It would remain within the company, working continuously, compounding, paying for the next voyage while the last one was still at sea, maintaining the forts and the factories, and the trading posts that formed the skeleton of the enterprise. The initial term of this arrangement was 10 years, though in practice the capital would remain locked in far longer, and the company would not permit full withdrawal even when that initial decade elapsed. You put your money in and it stayed in. This was, for an investor accustomed to the older model, an alarming proposition. What if you needed your money back? What if a decade felt suddenly very long when your daughter needed a dowry, or your roof needed repair, or you simply lost your taste for risk and wanted your guilders back in your hand where you could feel them? The company's answer to this concern was elegant and consequential in ways that reach all the way forward to the present day. If you wanted to leave the company, you could not simply demand your money back from the Treasury, that the Treasury would not give it to you, and in any case the money was aboard ships somewhere in the Indian Ocean, not sitting in a vault waiting to be returned. But what you could do was sell your share to someone else. You could find another investor who wanted what you now wished to release. You could transfer your ownership. And this simple arrangement, born of practical necessity, born of the gap between what an investor wanted and what the company could offer, gave birth to the secondary market. The world's first continuously tradable corporate shares, the Aandeel, came into being not because someone imagined them as an elegant financial innovation, but because there was no other way to square the circle between permanent capital and investor liquidity. The investor needed an exit. The company needed the money to stay. The market between buyers and sellers was the only solution that served both. By 1602, the year of the Charter, shares were being subscribed and a register kept of who owned what. And over the years that followed, as investors began to buy from and sell to one another, as the price of a share began to fluctuate with news of the company's fortunes, a fleet lost, a cargo arrived safely, a rival beaten back, or a treaty signed, the Amsterdam Exchange began to take on the recognizable shape of a modern stock market. The Amsterdam Beurs, the Bourse, which was formalized in its famous building in 1611, became the place where these transactions happened. Not just for the VOC, but for the financial instruments that grew up around it, that nested in its wake like smaller creatures around a great reef. Because once you had tradable shares, once the price of those shares could rise and fall, once there were people who wanted to buy and people who wanted to sell, and a market that connected them, you had created the conditions for everything else that markets eventually produce. You had created speculation. You had created the possibility of buying a share, not because you believed in the company's long-term prospects, but because you thought the price would rise tomorrow and you could sell to someone else. And you had created, almost inevitably, the possibility of the opposite, selling something you did not yet own, betting that the price would fall, planning to buy it later at a lower price to cover what you had promised. Short selling. Betting against the company. The man who did this first, in a form recognizable to any modern trader, was a large and combative former VOC shareholder named Isaac Le Maire. He had been a wealthy merchant, one of the early investors in the company, but he had fallen out with the Heeren 17th in a dispute over business conduct and been expelled from the company's inner circle. He did not take this quietly. Around 1609 and 1610, Le Maire organized what the records show as the first coordinated bear raid on record, a deliberate, planned effort to drive down the price of VOC shares by selling them short, selling contracts for shares he did not yet hold, in the expectation that the price would fall and he could acquire them more cheaply to honor his commitments. He also spread negative information about the company's prospects, another tactic that will feel familiar to anyone who has watched markets behave badly in more recent centuries. The raid failed in the end to break the company, but it alarmed the Heeren 17th enough that they appealed to the States General, and in 1610 a prohibition on short selling was issued, the first recorded regulatory response to a securities market manipulation. Even this is a first. Even the regulators trying to control the market appear here, in embryo, for the first time. The Amsterdam Exchange in those early decades was a laboratory for essentially every financial instrument and every financial pathology that would recur in markets for the next 400 years. Futures contracts, options, forward agreements, bear raids, pump and dump schemes, insider advantages. All of them were observed, named, and argued about in Amsterdam in the early 17th century, growing in the soil that VOC capital had fertilized. There is a document that sits in an archive in the Dutch city of Hoorn, in the province of North Holland, that brings all of this down to something you can hold in your hands, or imagine holding. It is a small piece of paper, handwritten, dated the 9th of September in the year 1606. It records that a man named Pieter Harmensz has subscribed for shares in the VOC's Enkhuizen chamber, one of the 6 regional chambers that made up the company's governance structure. The document is not large. It is not ornate. It is a business record, a ledger entry on paper, the kind of thing clerks wrote out by the 100 in any counting house in the Dutch Republic. But because it has survived the centuries, through fire and flood and war and the ordinary entropy of time, it has become something remarkable. It is the oldest known surviving share certificate in the world, the oldest piece of paper in existence that represents corporate ownership of the kind we still practice today. Pieter Harmensz. We know almost nothing else about him. He was one of more than 1,100 people who subscribed in the Amsterdam chamber alone in 1602, and there were other chambers with their own subscribers, ordinary men and women of the Dutch Republic who saw an opportunity and put their money in. The subscription lists of 1602 include not just wealthy merchants and powerful regents, but also, among the Amsterdam records, domestic servants, household employees, people of quite modest means who had scraped together whatever they could and bought a piece of the enterprise, maids, servants, workers who had never owned a piece of anything larger than their own tools or their own furniture, buying a share of the most ambitious commercial enterprise their world had ever attempted. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The VOC is often described in terms of its grandeur, its fleets, its fortresses, its sovereignty, its empire. And all of that is true, but it was also, in its founding moment, something that a maid in Amsterdam could buy into. The scale of the enterprise and the smallness of the individual investor coexisted from the very beginning, and this coexistence is part of what a public subscription, what we now call an initial public offering, means. Not just a privilege for the powerful, an offer to anyone who had the money and the faith to place it. Of course, having placed it, many of those smaller investors quickly discovered what it meant to have money locked in for a decade. The company did not pay its first dividend until 1610, 8 years after the initial subscriptions were taken. 8 years in which your guilders were at sea, in the holds of ships rounding the Cape of Good Hope, in warehouses in Bantam or Ambon, in the wages of soldiers you had never met guarding forts on islands you could not find on any map you owned. 8 years of news arriving slowly, if at all. A ship returned, a ship was lost, a battle fought somewhere near the equator, and your money entangled in all of it, unreachable. And then in 1610 the first dividend came, and it was not paid in money, it was paid, at least in part, in mace. Mace is the dried outer casing of the nutmeg seed, the same tree, a Myristica fragrans, that would become so central to the company's story in the years ahead. It is a vivid reddish-orange lace that wraps around the nutmeg inside, and when dried and ground, it yields a spice with something of nutmeg's warmth, but a quality distinctly its own, lighter, more delicate. In the kitchens of Europe, mace was prized, in the apothecaries of Europe it was prescribed, and in the ships of the VOC it was cargo, valuable, aromatic, dense with the scent of the tropical islands where it was harvested. The directors of the company, the Heeren 17th, faced a practical problem in 1610. The company had goods, It had spices in its warehouses, cargo brought back from the east at considerable cost and risk. What it did not have in sufficient liquid form was the cash to pay its shareholders a dividend out of simple money, and so the first dividend payment took the form, at least in part, of the commodity itself. Shareholders who had invested their guilders in a trading company received, as the return on their investment, quantities of mace, the spice itself, which they could then sell on the open market if they wished to convert it back to cash. This did not please everyone. An investor who had expected coin received a parcel of dried spice and was told to find his own buyer. The frustration was real and documented. Later, dividends would be paid in silver, in pepper, in various combinations of cash and commodity, and eventually the company settled more fully into cash payments as its operations matured. But that first dividend, in mace, captures something essential about what the VOC was in its earliest years. Not yet a purely financial abstraction, but still deeply materially entangled with the physical stuff it traded. The money and the spice had not yet fully separated. The return on your investment smelled of the tropics. Over the long arc of the company's life, the average dividend paid to VOC shareholders has been calculated at something in the neighborhood of 18% per year. This is a figure that sounds almost impossible by the standards of any modern investment, and it requires careful qualification. It is an average across nearly 2 centuries, a period that included both years of extraordinary prosperity and years, especially toward the end, when the company was borrowing heavily simply to maintain the appearance of returns that its actual operations no longer generated. The later decades, as we will come to in time, were ones in which dividends were paid not from profit but from debt, a slow financial fiction maintained to keep confidence alive long past the point where the underlying business warranted it. An average of 18% across 2 centuries conceals inside itself a great deal of variation, a great deal of struggle, and ultimately a great deal of dishonesty. But in the middle decades of the 17th century, the returns were real. The ships came back, the spices were sold, the warehouses in Amsterdam filled with pepper and nutmeg and cloves and cinnamon, and the buyers came, and the coin changed hands, and the ledgers showed profit, real profit from real trade, at markups that now seem almost unimaginable. There will be more to say about why the spices commanded such prices, about the specific chemistry of islands and trees, and the supply chains the VOC both relied upon and eventually tried to own entirely. That part of the story lies just ahead. For now, it is enough to know that the returns were real enough in those early and middle decades to justify the extraordinary trust that more than 1,000 Amsterdam investors had placed in the company back in 1602, and to support those returns to oil the machinery of trade across half the globe, the VOC needed a medium of exchange that could function in the complex, multi-currency, multi-language world of Asian commerce. Silver from the Americas, routed through Spain, and then the wider European trade, was the currency that oiled much of the world in the 17th century. The Spanish real was a near-universal medium of exchange across much of Asia, but the VOC also minted and issued its own coinage and trade tokens, instruments of value calibrated for use in the specific markets it operated in across Asia. To move goods between Japan and India, between Ceylon and Batavia, between 100 different ports with their own monetary customs and their own expectations of what constituted trustworthy payment, you needed instruments of exchange that were recognized, that carried the company's authority, that could be presented at a trading post in Nagasaki or a warehouse in Surat and be accepted without argument. A company with its own money. A company with its own courts, its own army, its own right to make war and conclude treaties. A company that could, in the territory it controlled, imprison a man, try him, and sentence him. These were powers that had, before the VOC, belonged exclusively to sovereigns, to kings and princes and the governments of states. The Charter of 1602 had granted them without any apparent sense that this was unusual, because it was not yet unusual in the framework of the era. The great trading companies of the age were expected to be quasi-governmental in the territories they occupied, because no government could project its power reliably to the other side of the world. The Charter simply acknowledged reality and made it legal. But what makes this moment in the story worth pausing over is the contrast between the ordinary humanity of Pieter Harmensz and his share certificate, the maids and servants of Amsterdam with their small subscriptions, the investors opening their ledger books and calculating their expected returns, and the weight of what was being built with their money. The financial machinery was elegant, genuinely innovative, solving real problems in clever ways. The Amsterdam exchange that grew around VOC shares gave the world an institution that every major economy on Earth now replicates, in one form or another. Short selling, forward contracts, options pricing, the very concept of continuously tradable corporate equity, these are not trivial things. They reshape the organization of capital, the distribution of risk, the very possibility of enterprises too large and too long-lived for any single patron to finance alone. The world we live in, the world of pension funds and stock portfolios and publicly traded companies, traces a direct line back to the Amsterdam Beurs of 1611 and the VOC axiom that first gave it purpose. And the money that flowed through that exchange, the 18% dividends in their best years, the mace paid out to frustrated shareholders in 1610, the silver that followed it, the coinage minted for Asian markets, all of it was underpinned by something growing in the soil of specific islands, tended by specific people, harvested from specific trees that the VOC would eventually decide it needed to own absolutely and protect with absolute violence. The financial abstraction and the physical reality were never truly separate. They were always the same thing, described in two different languages. You could say the whole complex superstructure of what we are calling the world's first modern corporation, the permanent capital, the tradable shares, the exchange, the dividends, was essentially an infrastructure built to answer one question. How do you reliably, at scale, bring the contents of those small green islands on the far side of the world to the warehouses and kitchens and apothecaries of Europe for long enough and reliably enough and profitably enough to justify the investment? The financial innovations were the answer. The islands were the question. And the answer required, in the end, doing something to those islands that no one writing a share certificate in Amsterdam in 1602 would necessarily have been able to imagine clearly, or perhaps would have wanted to. But we are not there yet, not quite. Let the financial architecture settle for a moment. Let it become solid in your mind. The idea of a share as a piece of something permanent, something that persists beyond any single voyage or any single season, that can be passed from hand to hand, and whose value fluctuates with the news that arrives in harbour after months at sea. Let the Amsterdam Exchange take shape, a courtyard, then a building, crowded with men in dark coats arguing about prices, passing paper contracts back and forth, the air smelling of canals and wool, and the faint ghost of spices from the nearby warehouses. Let Isaac Le Maire stand at the edge of it, bitter and determined, planning his coordinated assault on a share price, organizing the world's first bear raid with the methodical anger of a man who feels he has been wronged and intends to be compensated. All of this was new. All of it was genuinely historically new. Not a refinement of something that had come before, but a departure, a moment when the shape of commerce changed and did not change back. The men who built it were not philosophers imagining a better world. They were merchants trying to solve practical problems, how to raise more money than any single investor could provide, how to keep it working rather than paying it out after each voyage, how to let people leave if they needed to, without destroying the permanence that made the whole thing valuable. The solutions they found were elegant in the way that good engineering is elegant, not beautiful in the abstract, but effective, durable, exactly fitted to the problem at hand. And there is something fitting about the fact that the oldest surviving record of this system, the oldest share in the world, is not a grand declaration or a formal portrait, but a small piece of paper in a clerk's handwriting recording the investment of a man named Pieter Harmensz in the Enkhuizen chamber of the company, dated the 9th of September 1606. It sits in its archive now more than 400 years later, still legible, still carrying the name of an ordinary man who bought a piece of the most extraordinary enterprise his world had produced. We don't know what happened to him. We don't know if his investment paid off, if he lived to see dividends, if he sold his shares to someone else or held them until he died. The paper survived him, the company survived him by nearly 2 centuries, and the institution that his share helped to build. The idea of corporate equity, of publicly tradable ownership, of a market where the price of a piece of something is set by what buyers and sellers will agree to, survived them all and is still here. That is a kind of permanence that none of the men signing their names to subscription lists in 1602 could have foreseen. They were solving immediate problems, practical problems, problems of money and risk and liquidity. They were not building monuments. And yet they built something that has lasted longer than most monuments do and shaped more lives than any of them could have counted. The night is quieter now, isn't it? The weight of the day a little further away. Let these figures settle. The Lord 17 in their Amsterdam chamber, Pieter Harmensz with his piece of paper, the maid who put her savings into the subscription list and received 8 years later a small bundle of dried mace and was perhaps not entirely sure what to do with it. Let the Amsterdam exchange settle too, its courtyard filling with the low murmur of men who have discovered, slightly to their own surprise, that you can buy and sell the future as easily as you can buy and sell pepper, because the pepper and the nutmeg and the cloves are still out there, beyond the horizon. The islands are still warm, still fragrant, still untouched in the way that places are untouched when the violence that is coming for them has not yet arrived. The ships are being fitted, the orders are being written. The company that has just invented the modern stock market is about to discover what it means to own something absolutely. Not just to trade in it, not just to hold a share of it, but to possess it with the kind of possession that admits no competitors, no alternatives, no other way. What happens when a corporation decides that the only way to guarantee the supply of something is to make that something unable to exist anywhere else in the world, under any other set of hands? The answer to that question is still a little way ahead in the dark. Let it wait. Let the numbers rest and the names rest and the old paper in its archive rest. The mace has been paid out, the dividends recorded, the share prices argued over in the Amsterdam Beurs. The financial architecture of the modern world has been quietly assembled in the counting houses of the Dutch Republic, built from practical necessity by men who were mostly thinking about their next voyage and their next cargo. And somewhere beyond all of this, beyond the canals and the ledger books and the faint smell of spice in the warehouse air, the islands wait, as they have always waited, in the warm dark, heavy with fruit. The Banda Islands sit in the Banda Sea, which is itself a remote corner of the Maluku archipelago, which is itself a remote corner of a part of the world that most Europeans in 1600 could not have placed on a map with any confidence. There are 10 of them, roughly, depending on how you count the smaller rocks and shoals that ring the group. Volcanic islands, steep-sided, densely forested, rising from water so blue it looks painted. The largest, Banda Sea, is perhaps 10 kilometers long. Run, the westernmost, is smaller still, a sliver of land that takes perhaps an hour to walk end to end. And on these islands, on their rich volcanic soil, in their warm and humid air, grew something that the rest of the world wanted, with a desire that was, in retrospect, almost impossible to explain to anyone standing in the present day, holding a little glass jar of it from a grocery shelf, wondering what all the fuss was about. Myristica fragrans. The nutmeg tree. It is an evergreen, slow-growing, particular about its soil and its warmth, and at the time the VOC was founded, it grew, in any commercially significant quantity, almost nowhere on Earth except these islands, not in Europe, not in India, not in China, not along the African coast. Here, and essentially here alone, the pale yellow fruit split as it ripened to reveal a kernel, the nutmeg, wrapped in a crimson lacework called an aril. That aril, dried, became mace. The kernel, dried and grated, became the spice that had moved across half the world for centuries before a single Dutch ship ever saw these waters. Arab traders had carried it to India. Indian traders had moved it toward Persia and the Mediterranean. By the time it reached a market in Venice or Lisbon or Amsterdam, it had passed through so many hands, paid so many tolls, crossed so many seas that its price bore almost no relation to what it had cost to pluck from the tree. And here is the number that explains everything that is about to happen. Nutmeg purchased on the Banda Islands could sell in Europe for many hundreds of times what was paid for it at the source. Not a modest profit, not twice, not 10 times, hundreds of times. A small wooden crate of dried nutmeg bought from a Bandanese farmer for a few bolts of cloth or a handful of copper coins became in Amsterdam something worth the equivalent of a craftsman's yearly wages. And mace, the crimson wrapping, the aril, commanded prices at least as high, sometimes higher. These were not luxury goods in the way a pearl necklace is a luxury good, worn to show that you have money and don't need to think about it. They were luxury goods in the way that medicine is a luxury good when you are sick and frightened and will pay anything to have it. Because the Europeans of the 16th and 17th centuries believed, with a sincerity that has to be understood in its own terms, that nutmeg and cloves and mace had medicinal properties that went far beyond flavor. They were used in apothecaries alongside the more recognized herbs prescribed for stomach complaints and fevers, and a dozen other ailments for which there was in truth no good remedy. And beyond medicine, the spices carried something harder to pin down, a belief, widespread and persistent, that they could protect against plague. In a world where bubonic plague returned in waves, where a city could lose a third of its population in a season, where the smell of death was literally in the air, the idea that these fragrant Eastern substances might ward off the contagion gave them a value that was more than economic. They were the closest thing many people had to a guarantee against a death they feared above all others. This is why the markup was possible. This is why Amsterdam merchants were willing to outfit ships that took 8 months to sail to these islands, lose a significant fraction of their crews to scurvy and fever and storm, fight competitors on 3 continents, and still consider the voyage worthwhile. The ratio of price to cost was simply extraordinary, and the VOC, once it had been chartered and organized and given its monopoly east of the Cape of Good Hope, was not about to share it with anyone. Cloves grew on a slightly different set of islands in the same Maluku archipelago, on Ternate, on Tidore, on Ambon. Each of these a volcanic island with its own local rulers, its own networks, its own long history of trading with Arab and Chinese and Malay merchants before the Portuguese arrived in the early 1500s and tried, with uneven success, to seize the trade for themselves. By the time the Dutch appeared, the Portuguese had been in these waters for a century and had built forts and established relationships and made enemies in roughly equal measure. The VOC did not arrive as strangers in an empty sea. It arrived into a world that already had its own economics, its own politics, its own intricate web of alliances and rivalries, and it proceeded to remake that world methodically in the image of its own requirements. The method was not subtle. If you control the supply of something, you control the price. And if you control the price, you control the profit. But that logic only holds if you truly control the supply. If there is nowhere else for buyers to go, nowhere else for sellers to sell. The VOC understood this with a clarity that was almost clinical, and so it undertook what it called, with a word that has its own quiet horror, extirpation. Extirpation means uprooting. It means going into a forest or a garden or a plantation and pulling up the trees, cutting them down, burning them, making the ground bare. Not because the trees have done anything wrong, but because they are growing in the wrong place, under the wrong hands, beyond the reach of the monopoly. If nutmeg grew in the Bandas and only in the Bandas, and if the VOC controlled the Bandas absolutely, then the price in Amsterdam stayed high. But if nutmeg began to spread, carried by a seed, by a bird, by a passing English merchant who thought to plant a seedling on a different island, then the monopoly frayed and the price fell, and the whole magnificent financial structure began to loosen. And so the VOC sent out parties with axes and fire, not once, not as an emergency measure. Regularly, systematically, across decades, the crews of VOC vessels would go ashore on islands where clove or nutmeg trees were growing outside the company's controlled territory, and they would destroy them, cut down every tree, uproot every seedling, leave the soil bare, then sail away. It was, by any reasonable description, the deliberate destruction of an ecosystem in the service of a price target. A corporation reshaping the natural world to protect its spreadsheets. And it worked. For decades, it worked extraordinarily well. But the trees in the Bandas themselves still had to be harvested by someone. And the people who had been harvesting them for generations, the Bandanese, had their own ideas about that. The Bandanese were not a unified political entity in the European sense. They had no single king, no central authority. Their society was organized around a class of local leaders, the orang kaya, a Malay phrase meaning roughly the wealthy or the men of standing. These were the men who negotiated with traders, who made agreements on behalf of their communities, who had been doing business with Arab and Javanese and Chinese merchants long before any European ship appeared on their horizon. They were experienced traders. They understood contracts and obligations, and the basic principle that you did not sell everything you had to one buyer at one price if you could sell it to 3 buyers and let them compete. And this was precisely the problem. The VOC wanted what every monopolist wants: an exclusive contract, a guaranteed supply at a fixed price with no competitor allowed in. The orang kaya of the Bandas signed agreements and then found other buyers because other buyers offered better terms. English merchants, who also wanted nutmeg and who had their own claims on some of the islands, continued to appear and to trade. The Bandanese sold to them. The VOC complained, threatened, and eventually decided that the problem was not the contracts or the prices, but the people. That as long as the Bandanese retained their own political structures and their own commercial instincts, the monopoly would never be truly secure. The man who resolved this problem in the most direct way available was Jan Pieter Soen Cohen. Cohen had been born in Hoorn, one of the 6 VOC chamber cities. In 1587, he was an accountant by training, which is perhaps relevant because he approached the question of the Bandas with the same cold arithmetic he might have applied to a balance sheet. The problem was defined, the solution was identified, the cost was calculated, and the operation was executed. He had been appointed Governor-General, the highest office in the VOC's Asian operations. With his seat at a headquarters he was still in the process of establishing. And in 1621 he sailed for the Bandas with a fleet and a plan. The plan was conquest, absolute, total, and, this is not too strong a word, eliminatory conquest. The Bandanese had resisted the VOC's exclusive demands. They had continued trading with English merchants and with others. They had killed a VOC representative during a failed earlier negotiation, an act the company had neither forgotten nor forgiven. Cohen arrived not to renegotiate, but to end the question permanently. What followed across the weeks of the 1621 campaign was the near-total destruction of the Bandanese people as a functioning society. The population of the islands before the conquest has been estimated at around 15,000. The estimate is uncertain, as all such estimates from this period are, but 15,000 is the number that historians work with, understanding that it carries a margin of error. After the conquest, after the killing and the starvation and the flight, and the enslavement and the deportation, the number of Bandanese remaining on the islands fell to something that later estimates put in the low hundreds, perhaps as high as 1,000, not 1,500, not 5,000, perhaps 1,000 scattered and broken on islands that had held a civilization for generations. The arithmetic is not comfortable to sit with even at this remove. Among the methods Cohen employed was something that stands out even in the brutal context of colonial conquest. He had brought with him Japanese mercenaries, ronin, masterless samurai, men whose profession was violence and who had no particular loyalty to anyone beyond the terms of their contract. And in one notorious episode of the campaign, around 40 of the Orang Kaya, the leaders of Bandanese society, were brought before these men and executed, beheaded, and then quartered. The bodies were displayed. The purpose was not simply to kill, but to demonstrate in terms that could not be misunderstood that the old order was finished, that the men who had negotiated and resisted and maintained the Bandanese claim to their own commerce were gone, and that what came next would be entirely on the VOC's terms. A line is sometimes attributed to Cohen. Whether he wrote it in exactly these words, or whether the formulation was refined in later years, is the sort of thing historians argue about, but the sentiment was undeniably his. Disperiert niet, ontziet uw vijanden niet, do not despair, spare not your enemies. It was a motto for a man who had decided that the distance between the counting house and the battlefield was smaller than it looked, that commerce and violence were not opposites, but instruments of the same purpose, to be deployed in whatever combination the situation required. The bandas were reorganized. The islands that had been a living, working society with their own trade networks and their own social hierarchies were parceled out into what the VOC called perken, plantations. Each perk was a defined territory of nutmeg groves assigned to a Dutch or sometimes mixed heritage colonist called a perkeneer. The perkeneer was responsible for producing a certain quantity of nutmeg each year, sold to the VOC at a fixed price the VOC itself set. It was, in its economic structure, a form of franchised agriculture, except that the original farmers had been killed or displaced, and the labor that worked the groves was not free. Because the population of the islands had been so thoroughly destroyed, there were no Bandanese left to do the work, and so the VOC imported enslaved labor. People taken, purchased, or seized from other parts of the archipelago, from Bali, from Java, from Sulawesi, and other islands, were brought to the bandas to harvest the nutmeg that had grown there since long before any European named it, in the groves that had been tended by people who were no longer there. The perkeneers who managed these estates were themselves in a constrained position, obliged to sell their entire harvest to the VOC at the VOC's price, unable to trade with anyone else, dependent on the company for everything from tools to the credit that allowed them to keep the operation running from one season to the next. The island of Run was a particular case. Run was the westernmost of the Banda group, small and difficult to reach, but its nutmeg groves were substantial, and the English, through their own East India Company, had established a claim to it. For years, Run was a point of contest, an English foothold in the middle of what the VOC considered its exclusive territory, a visible refutation of the monopoly's completeness. The English flag flew on run, English ships called there. The VOC found this intolerable and eventually it was resolved. But not until decades later, and the resolution, when it came, was one of the stranger diplomatic transactions in the history of property. Before that resolution arrives, though, the story has to move to a different island, one that was not in the Banda Sea at all, but that was about to become the center of gravity for everything the VOC was doing in Asia. In 1619, 2 years before the Banda conquest, Cohen had addressed a different problem. The VOC needed a permanent headquarters in Asia, a base that was not just a trading post but a fortified city, a seat of government, a place from which the company's vast and growing network of operations could be administered and defended. The obvious location was the coast of Java, the large island that controlled the western approaches to the Maluku Sea. There was already a trading town there on the northwestern coast at the mouth of the Ciliwung River. It was called Jayakarta, and it was governed by a local ruler with his own political connections and his own ideas about how much control he was willing to cede to a Dutch trading company. Cohen solved this problem the way he solved most problems. He seized Jayakarta, burned it, and built something new on the ruins. The new city was named Batavia, after the Batavi, an ancient Germanic tribe that lived in the Rhine Delta in Roman times, and whom the Dutch of the 17th century claimed as ancestors. A somewhat strained genealogical argument, but useful for the purposes of giving a new colonial city a name with a sense of deep, legitimate roots. It is the city now known as Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, and it has been continuously inhabited since Cohen raised its first walls, which makes it one of those places where the act of founding sits under the present like a buried foundation, invisible but load-bearing. Batavia became the seat of the Governor-General. It housed the Council of the Indies, the Raad van India, which was the governing body of the entire VOC Asian enterprise, the body that made decisions, heard disputes, issued orders, and attempted to manage a trading empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the coast of Japan. From Batavia, ships were dispatched and recalled. From Batavia, the accounts of every VOC factory in Asia were eventually compiled and sent back to the Heren 17th in the Netherlands. It was the hinge of the whole operation, the place where the commercial logic of Amsterdam translated into the daily reality of governance and force across half a world. The city was built in the Dutch manner. This was both a statement of identity and, as it turned out, a considerable practical error. The Dutch built canals. In Amsterdam, canals were the circulatory system of the city. They carried goods and people and kept the city's commerce moving. In the low-lying tropical swampy ground of northwestern Java, canals became something else. They became still water in a hot climate. They became breeding grounds for mosquitoes. They became the vector for malaria, for dysentery, for the accumulation of waste and disease in a city that was growing faster than its infrastructure could manage. The same waterways that in Amsterdam signified prosperity and civic order signified in Batavia slow death. Batavia acquired a reputation. It was called, in the accounts of travelers and merchants and company officials who passed through it or were posted there, a graveyard of Europeans. The mortality rates for VOC personnel in Batavia were, by the standards of the time, extraordinary. And the standards of the time were not gentle. Men arrived from the Netherlands, often young, often the first in their family to go to sea, and they died in the company's service at a rate that would be shocking even in an era when disease killed people routinely and unexpectedly. The exact figures varied by year and by epidemic cycle, but the reputation was earned. You might go to Batavia and do well. You might accumulate enough credit with the company to eventually go home to the Netherlands with something to show for your years away. Or you might die of fever within 6 months of arriving in a white-painted room beside a stagnant canal very far from the country whose shapes and smells you had grown up knowing. And then, in 1740, Batavia became the site of something different. Not the slow, ambient death of disease, but a massacre. The city had a large population of ethnic Chinese residents. The Chinese had been present in this part of the world for centuries, as traders and craftsmen and farmers, and in Batavia they occupied an important economic role. They ran much of the small commerce of the city, the markets and workshops and small enterprises that kept a city functioning beneath the level of the VOC's great trading operations. In 1740, amid fears of a Chinese uprising, fears that were partly real, partly manufactured by rumor and tension, and the paranoia that accumulates in a colonial city that knows it is outnumbered, the Dutch authorities and Allied troops turned on the Chinese population of Batavia. The killing lasted several days. The estimates of those who died range widely, but the figure most commonly cited is around 10,000. 10,000 people killed over the course of days in a city that the VOC had built as the center of its commercial empire. It was called the Chinesenmoord, the Chinese murder. It did not collapse the company, it did not produce significant legal consequences, and the trade continued. History absorbed it, as history absorbs a great many things that should perhaps have been less easily absorbed. But there is something here that matters for understanding what the VOC was and what it had become by the mid-18th century. A company chartered to trade spices had built a city, garrisoned it with soldiers, organized a governing council, and found itself responsible for the lives and deaths of tens of thousands of people who were not Dutch, who had not chosen to be governed by a trading company, and whose welfare was not, and had never been, a primary concern of the Heren 17th in Amsterdam. The Charter had given the VOC the right to wage war and administer justice, and it had exercised those rights in ways that went far beyond what even the most expansive reading of a commercial mandate might justify. This is the braided reality of the VOC, and it cannot be separated without falsifying both strands. The financial innovations were real, the permanent capital structure, the publicly subscribed shares, the tradable Action, the Amsterdam Exchange, where investors bought and sold pieces of a company that owned an ocean. All of this was genuinely new, genuinely consequential, the foundation of something that continued to operate and evolve for centuries after the VOC itself was gone. And the violence was real. Not incidental, not regrettable excess, but integral. The instrument by which the monopoly was created and maintained, the means by which the price differentials that paid those 18% dividends were preserved against competition and against the natural tendency of markets to equalize. You cannot have one without the other. The dividend and the conquest were the same fact, seen from different ends. And now the run for Manhattan question, which has been waiting since the very beginning of this story, can be answered, because in 1667, after years of English-Dutch rivalry that had already produced one naval war and was about to produce another, the two countries sat down to negotiate the Treaty of Breda. The English had certain claims and the Dutch had certain claims, and the treaty was about resolving them, trading territories, drawing lines, agreeing on who owned what and who could trade where, in the way that European powers periodically agreed on such things in the 17th century, with a sense that the map was a negotiable instrument and that what had been taken by force could sometimes be returned by diplomacy if the terms were right. The English held an island in North America. It was a substantial island at the mouth of a river in a harbor that was becoming recognized as one of the finest in the eastern seaboard. The Dutch had called it New Amsterdam when they had it, and they had built a town at its southern tip, and then the English had taken it in 1664 and renamed it New York. The Dutch wanted it back. Or more precisely, the Dutch acknowledged that it was gone, that the English held it, and were unlikely to give it up, and moved on. What the Dutch wanted was run. Run, the small Nutmeg island at the western edge of the Bandas, still technically claimed by the English, still a persistent affront to the completeness of the VOC's monopoly. In the exchange negotiated under the Treaty of Breda, the English formalized their cession of Run to the Dutch, and the Dutch formalized their cession of their claim to Manhattan, a nutmeg island smaller than a city park, traded for the future site of the world's largest financial center. At the time, in 1667, with Nutmeg commanding its extraordinary markups and Manhattan being a modest colonial settlement of a few thousand people, the Dutch were not obviously making a poor trade. Nutmeg was the future, or so it seemed. The Banda Islands were the source of one of the world's most valuable commodities. Manhattan was a promising harbor town in a cold northern colony where things were developing slowly. History, of course, had other plans. But in the logic of 1667, in the arithmetic of the VOC and its monopoly, and the price of nutmeg in the markets of Amsterdam and London and Lisbon, the swap made sense. It made exactly the kind of sense that the VOC made, a sense built on the assumption that the spice trade was permanent, that the monopoly was durable, that the islands would always be the islands, and the prices would always be the prices. The assumption that nothing fundamental would change, that what had been built could be maintained forever, that a corporation that had been powerful enough to make its own rules was powerful enough to keep them. The assumption was wrong. But that part of the story belongs to what comes next, to the slow unwinding of a century of power, to the ways in which everything the VOC had built began quietly at first, and then with increasing speed to come apart. The groves are still fragrant. The canals of Batavia are still there, underneath the streets of a city that has grown in all directions from the footprint Cohen laid out in the ruins of Jayakarta. The nutmeg trees on the Banda Islands still produce their fruit, tended by other hands now, in a world where the monopoly is long gone, and nutmeg costs what it costs in every grocery store on every continent, unremarkable and cheap, and entirely unaware of the blood that was spilled to keep it rare. But the VOC is not done yet, not in this story, because what made it fall is as instructive as what made it rise, and the mechanisms of its decline were already present, in embryonic form, in the very structure of its success. The corruption that would eventually hollow it out was not a late arrival, not something that appeared in the 18th century from nowhere. It was built into the distance, the vast, oceanic distance between the Heren Sixtentieve in Amsterdam and the Governor-General in Batavia, between the ledger books in the Netherlands and the daily reality of a man on a trading post in Persia or India or Japan, handling goods and silver and making decisions that would take months to be reviewed, if they were reviewed at all. The architecture of the company's power was also the architecture of its vulnerability, and both had been present from the beginning. For now, though, let the groves rest in the dark, and the canals lie still, and the ships of the VOC sit in the harbour at Batavia with their cargo and their company flags in the years before the long erosion begins. The company is at the height of what it can be. The monopoly is, for the moment, more or less intact. The dividends are being paid, the accounts are being kept, and the network of factories and forts and trading relationships that the company has spent decades building stretches across an arc of the world that no single organization had ever spanned before. There is more to see in it yet. The narrow island in a Japanese harbor, the resupply station at the foot of Africa, the cinnamon island and the sugar island and the silk routes and the silver routes, and all the intricate plumbing of a commercial empire that carried goods and money and people across half the earth. All of that still waits further along in the night. And the most intricate part of that plumbing was not the route between Amsterdam and Asia at all. It was the web of routes that never touched Europe. Think of the VOC not as a single pipeline running east-west between the Dutch Republic and the Spice Islands, but as something far more complicated, a great arterial network branching and crossing itself at dozens of points between the Cape of Good Hope and the coast of Japan, moving goods from one part of Asia to another, profiting on each exchange, carrying Indian cloth to Indonesia, Indonesian pepper to Persia, Persian silver to India, Indian cotton to Japan, Japanese copper back to the archipelago. This was what the merchants of the time called the country trade, the carrying trade within Asia itself, and it was for long stretches of the company's life at least as important as the famous route home to Amsterdam. The VOC was not simply shipping spices to Europe, it was running the internal commerce of half a continent, inserting itself into trading relationships that had existed for centuries before any Dutch ship had ever rounded the Cape, and extracting profit at every node of the network. The logic of it was simple, even if the execution was anything but. The spices that came from the Banda Islands and the Clove Islands of the Moluccas had to be paid for, and paying for them in silver or gold carried all the way from Amsterdam was expensive and slow. But if you could sell Indian textiles in Indonesia, and the Javanese and the Bandanese had been buying Indian cloth for generations, exchanging it for their spices in a trade that was ancient before the Portuguese arrived, then you could use the proceeds from that cloth to buy the spices directly without drawing down your European reserves. And if you could also sell those same Indonesian spices in Japan and take Japanese copper and silver back to India, where copper and silver were in demand, and use those metals to buy more Indian cloth, the circle completed itself, and the profit accumulated at every turn. Textiles from the Coromandel coast of India, the southeastern shore that runs roughly through what is now Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, moved into the archipelago. Silk and porcelain from China moved through the ports of the region. Persian goods came west to east, Japanese silver and copper travelled south and west, and all of it passed, as much as the VOC could arrange, through VOC hands, aboard VOC ships, taxed and logged and managed by VOC factors, sitting in VOC factories, which is what the company called its trading posts, a word that in that era simply meant a place where a factor, a commercial agent, kept accounts and held goods. This was the real engine, and it hummed continuously, year in and year out, largely invisible to the shareholder in Amsterdam who thought of the VOC primarily as a spice company. The spice trade was the reason the company had been built. The country trade was the reason it could afford to keep running. And at the far, remote, extraordinary end of that intra-Asian network stood an island that was not a natural island at all. Dejima is a name that is not much known outside of specialist histories and the narrow neighborhood of Nagasaki where it once stood. But for more than 2 centuries, it was one of the most peculiar and consequential places on the surface of the earth. It was a fan-shaped artificial island built from the sea by Japanese laborers in 1636, connected to the city of Nagasaki by a single guarded bridge, and measuring roughly 200 meters long and 70 wide. Smaller than a city block, smaller than many a merchant's warehouse, ringed by water on all sides, and watched at the bridge by guards whose job it was to ensure that nothing and no one moved between the island and the mainland without permission. Japan in 1641 was in the process of closing itself. The Tokugawa shogunate, having consolidated power and looking with deep suspicion at the foreign missionaries and merchants who had been filtering into the country for a century, had decided to end most of that contact. Portuguese traders and missionaries were expelled. The Christian communities that had grown up in the south of Japan were suppressed violently. The policy known as Sakoku, the closed country, was settling into place like a heavy door being drawn shut. Foreign ships would no longer be welcomed in Japanese ports. Foreign merchants would no longer be permitted to reside on Japanese soil. But there were exceptions. The Chinese were permitted to trade under strict conditions in Nagasaki. and the Dutch, specifically the VOC, were permitted to remain under conditions that were strict to a degree that would have been humiliating to almost any other trading nation. They were confined to Dejima, they could not leave without permission, they could not bring their wives, they could not build churches or conduct Christian worship. They were required to participate in certain ceremonial acknowledgements of Japanese authority. The annual court journey to Edo, the shogun's capital, where the head of the Dutch trading post presented himself, brought gifts, answered questions, and performed whatever small acts of submission the occasion required. And they accepted all of it. They accepted it because the alternative was to be expelled entirely, and the trade was too valuable to surrender on a point of pride. What passed through Dejima in those 2+ centuries of confinement was considerable. Dutch merchants traded in Japanese copper. The archipelago was rich in it, and copper was in demand across Asia. Japanese silver moved out. Dutch goods came in and threw them slowly, carefully, across the single guarded bridge and into the minds of Japanese scholars and officials who were curious about the world beyond their shores, a trickle of European knowledge. The Japanese called it rangaku, Dutch learning, and through the tiny aperture of Dejima, Japanese physicians and astronomers and engineers and scholars absorbed European medicine, European astronomy, European military technology, European cartography. The flow was narrow, but it was not nothing. For over 2 centuries, the Netherlands was the only window through which Japan could look out at the West, and the only window through which the West could, in the most limited and supervised fashion, look in at Japan. When Japan finally opened, when the American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in 1853 with his black ships and his demands, and the door that had been closed for 200 years was forced open again, the Japanese found that they had not been entirely in the dark about the world they were re-entering. They had been watching it carefully through a fan-shaped island in Nagasaki Harbor. The VOC held that position from 1641. It lost it only when the VOC itself ceased to exist. Turn now from the far northeast to the far southwest, to the other end of the arc that the company spanned. The Cape of Good Hope is the point where the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean begin to press against each other, where the water is deep and cold and the winds are among the most reliable and the most violent on the planet. Sailors rounding the Cape, going east toward Asia or west back toward Europe, needed food, water, fresh provisions, and a place to repair ships that had been at sea for months. The Portuguese had known this for more than a century. The VOC had been using the Cape as a waypoint since its earliest voyages. But in 1652, the company decided to do something more deliberate. It sent a small expedition under a man named Jan van Riebeek to establish a permanent resupply station at the Cape. Not a settlement, the company was clear, not a colony. The Heeren 17 did not want the expense and complexity of governing a colony at the foot of Africa. They wanted a garden, a place where ships could stop, take on vegetables and fresh water and meat, and continue their voyage without losing half the crew to scurvy before they reached Asia. Jan van Riebeek arrived in April 1652, and the station he planted grew in the way that things planted in good soil have a habit of growing. What was intended to remain small became larger. The company allowed a small number of employees to be freed from their contracts and to farm the land as independent settlers, free burghers, to supply the station with produce. Enslaved people were brought from other parts of the VOC's trading network, from West Africa, from Madagascar, from the coasts of India and Indonesia, to work those farms. The indigenous Khoikhoi people, who had lived on the Cape Peninsula for generations, were displaced and marginalized. A community took root, speaking a language that was slowly diverging from Dutch into what would become Afrikaans, building a society on the southern tip of Africa whose origins lay in a company's decision that it needed somewhere to stock up on onions and beef. What began as a vegetable garden became Cape Town, What was intended as a waypoint became the seed of a nation. The VOC did not plan it, but it happened, as so many of the company's consequences happened, through the simple momentum of commercial necessity accumulating over decades until it became something nobody had originally intended and nobody could easily undo. Further along the arc, to the northeast of the Cape and across the Indian Ocean, the island of Ceylon, the great teardrop hanging from the southern tip of India, the island that the world now calls Sri Lanka, had been a Portuguese possession, or partly one, since the early 16th century. The Portuguese had found there something they valued almost as much as the Dutch valued nutmeg, cinnamon. Real cinnamon, Cinnamomum verum, the inner bark of a tree that grew along the island's western coast and nowhere else in commercial quantity, used across the world as a spice and a medicine and a luxury, commanding prices that made the effort of empire worthwhile. The Portuguese had worked hard to hold it. In 1638, the VOC allied with the King of Kandy, the inland kingdom of Ceylon that had never submitted to Portuguese rule, and began a series of campaigns that eventually expelled the Portuguese from the island's coastal fortresses. By 1658, the VOC controlled Ceylon's coast and with it the cinnamon monopoly, and as they had done with nutmeg and with cloves, they worked to ensure that cinnamon from Ceylon went through them and only through them. To the north and west, the port of Malacca, the great entrepot at the narrow strait where the Indian Ocean trade and the South China Sea trade had been converging for centuries, had also been in Portuguese hands since 1511. The VOC took Malacca from the Portuguese in 1641 after a siege conducted in alliance with the Sultan of Johor. The straits through which the trade of maritime Asia funneled were now, in large part, watched by VOC cannon and administered by VOC officials. And then there was the island the company called Formosa, which the world calls Taiwan. The VOC established a presence there in 1624, building a fort on the southwestern coast. Fort Zeelandia, named for the Dutch province, a name still remembered on the island today. Taiwan in the 17th century was a node in the trade between China and Japan, Chinese goods, Japanese silver, and the VOC inserted itself into that exchange from its fortified position on the western coast. Formosa produced deer hides, sugar, and rice. It was a useful station. The company held it for nearly 40 years, and then, in 1662, a man called Koxinga arrived. His full name was Zheng Chenggong, a Ming loyalist commander who had been fighting a losing war against the Qing dynasty that had swept down from Manchuria and overturned the Ming Empire. Pushed south and east, needing a base, Koxinga sailed across the Taiwan Strait with an army and laid siege to Fort Zeelandia. After 9 months, the VOC garrison, outnumbered, undersupplied, and without prospect of relief, surrendered. The Dutch were expelled from Taiwan. They never returned. The company that had planted flags across an arc of the world from the Cape of Good Hope to Nagasaki Harbor lost its foothold on Formosa to a Ming general fighting the last campaign of a lost dynasty, and the island passed out of VOC hands and into a history that would eventually, centuries later, become one of the most closely watched territorial disputes on the face of the earth. Consider the scale of what had been built. A company that had begun in 1602 as a merger of quarrelsome trading firms, funded by the guilder subscriptions of Amsterdam merchants and maids and servants, had within a few decades constructed something that looked, from the outside, far more like an empire than a business. It maintained forts and factories from the Cape of Good Hope to the coast of Japan. It had expelled the Portuguese from Ceylon and Malacca. It had held Taiwan for nearly 4 decades. It ran the only Western trading post permitted inside the closed Empire of Japan. It had planted what would become Cape Town on the southern tip of Africa. It had, on the Banda Islands, reduced a population of some 15,000 people to a remnant in order to seize control of the world's nutmeg supply. It ran its own courts, minted its own coins, commanded its own army of tens of thousands of soldiers, and maintained a fleet that was among the largest afloat. And to fill all of those ships, to staff all of those forts, to man all of those trading posts and warehouses and garrison walls across the breadth of Asia and beyond, the VOC had to move people, an enormous number of people. Over the full span of its nearly 2 centuries of operation, close to 1 million Europeans made the voyage east under VOC employment: sailors, soldiers, clerks, merchants, surgeons, carpenters, coopers, gunsmiths. They came from the Netherlands, from Germany, from Scandinavia, from all across the European continent, drawn by wages that were modest and by the distant possibility of profit, or simply by the absence of anything better at home. The voyage itself was a thing that anyone who undertook it understood might well kill them. The ships of the VOC were not comfortable. They were workhorses, built for cargo capacity and seaworthiness rather than passenger ease, and the conditions below decks were cramped, damp, and unsanitary. A voyage from Amsterdam to Batavia took somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 months, sometimes less, sometimes considerably more, depending on winds and weather and the route taken. 8 months at sea. 8 months of brackish water, hardtack that might be infested with weevils, salt meat that had long since lost whatever virtue it once possessed. 8 months in which the disease that sailors dreaded above almost all others, scurvy, the slow dissolution of the body that comes from the absence of fresh fruit and vegetables over weeks and months, the bleeding gums, the reopening of old wounds, the profound weakness could take hold and spread through a lower deck with dreadful efficiency. Storms off the Cape could dismast a ship or drive it onto rocks. Fires could break out. Ships could simply disappear, swallowed by the ocean with no record of what had happened. A large fraction of the men who left Amsterdam never came back. Not because they returned to Europe by another route or settled permanently in Asia, but because they died at sea or in Batavia or at one of the many smaller posts along the arc of the empire, taken by malaria or dysentery, or the dozen other fevers that the tropics offered to constitutions that had no immunity to them. The company that was the engine of so much European wealth was also the vehicle for the deaths of an extraordinary number of the men it employed. And by the 18th century, it was becoming something else as well. It was becoming a machine for its own corruption. The signs had been there from the beginning, as the tail end of the previous night's narration made plain. The distance was the problem. The distance between Amsterdam and Batavia, between the Heeren 17th and the man on the ground, was too great to be bridged by inspection or accountability. A ship carrying a dispatch took months to arrive. A reply took months more. The VOC factor sitting in his warehouse in Persia or Ceylon or at Dejima in Nagasaki, surrounded by goods and silver and opportunities for private profit, knew that even if he was caught diverting company goods to his own account, the consequences were distant and delayed, and the company's accounting was not good enough across that distance to catch most of what was quietly taken. There was a word for it in the informal vocabulary of the company's own employees: Mawson. Pilfering. It covered a range of behaviors from the small and almost inevitable, a sailor pocketing a handful of pepper from a cargo hold, a clerk adjusting a figure in a ledger, to the substantial and systematic company officials running their own private trades alongside the official ones, skimming from the cargoes, accepting bribes, cutting deals for personal enrichment that undercut the company's own commercial position. It was endemic. It was, in some sense, structural, built into the conditions of the company's operation, attacks that distance and isolation and the lack of effective oversight levied on the enterprise from its very earliest years. But in the 18th century, the scale of the problem grew, and the underlying commercial conditions that had concealed it began to erode. The spice monopoly, the great engine of the VOC's early wealth, was no longer what it had been. Part of this was the company's own doing, or rather, the doing of its predecessors in the 17th century, who had prosecuted the monopoly with such violence that the network of production and distribution was now expensive to police. Extirpation, the deliberate destruction of clove and nutmeg trees outside the controlled islands, was a policy that required constant vigilance and occasional brutal enforcement. And as the company's administrative overhead grew, and its capacity for that kind of violence became more costly, the monopoly began to leak. Spice plants, despite all efforts, did eventually reach other soils. The world was large and the company could not watch every shore. At the same time, the tastes of Europe were shifting in ways that the founders of the VOC could not have foreseen, and the later directors found impossible to reverse. The great spice mania of the 16th and 17th centuries, the extraordinary European appetite for pepper and nutmeg and cloves and cinnamon that had been the commercial justification for every Portuguese and Dutch and English venture into Asia, was not a permanent feature of the world. It had been driven partly by genuine utility and partly by fashion, by the association of spices with luxury and sophistication and medical virtue. And fashions change. Coffee arrived in Europe and spread with astonishing speed through the 17th century, creating a new category of desire, the coffeehouse culture that transformed European social life. Tea followed, moving from curiosity to staple, becoming in England especially a necessity so fundamental that it would eventually reshape trade routes and trigger wars of its own. Textiles, cotton especially, began to occupy the commercial imagination in ways that spices no longer could. The new wants of Europe were not nutmeg and mace. They were coffee and tea and printed cloth, and those were not, at least not yet, things the VOC was positioned to deliver with the same exclusivity it had once exercised over the Spice Islands. The company's costs, meanwhile, kept rising. Wars in Asia, not just the campaigns that had established the empire in the first place, but the constant friction of maintaining it, defending it against rivals and against the Asian polities that chafed under VOC dominance, consumed money continuously. The administrative structure that the Heeren 17th had built across decades, the layers of governors and councils and factors and soldiers and clerks, was expensive to maintain and increasingly difficult to reform. The dividend payments that shareholders had come to expect, that average of roughly 18% per year that had been the great promise of the VOC investment over its golden decades, could not simply be suspended without causing panic and collapse in the company's share price and its credit. So the company did what desperate institutions do when their income falls short of their obligations. It borrowed. Not once, not occasionally, but persistently structurally, the VOC began paying its dividends not from the profits of trade, but from loans. It was borrowing money in order to give money to its shareholders, which is a way of saying that it was slowly consuming itself, converting the substance of the company into a stream of payments that gave the appearance of continued prosperity while the foundations quietly gave way. The Amsterdam Exchange, the same institution that the VOC had done so much to create, watched the company's share price and its creditworthiness with a skepticism that grew year by year. And then came the blow that the company, in its weakened state, could not absorb. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War began in 1780 and ended in 1784, and it was, by any measure, a catastrophe for the Netherlands and for the VOC in particular. Britain and the Netherlands had been rivals for much of the 17th century. The three Anglo-Dutch wars of that era had been expensive and bloody and inconclusive enough to exhaust both parties. But by the later 18th century, the balance of power had shifted. The British Royal Navy was a thing of formidable reach and competence. The Dutch fleet was not what it had been, and the war came at the worst possible moment, when the VOC's finances were already stretched to the point of fragility. British naval action disrupted VOC shipping across the network. Trading posts and factories were taken, ships were intercepted, The flow of goods and silver that kept the company's arteries functioning was interrupted repeatedly in ways that a healthy company might have survived, but that a company already living on borrowed money could not. The war lasted 4 years. When it ended, the damage to the VOC was not the kind that could be repaired. The final decade of the 18th century was the company's dying decade. The VOC struggled on, its accounts a maze of debt and concealed losses, its officials in Asia continuing to skim what they could from a diminishing pile, its shareholders receiving dividends funded by credit that could not be sustained. The Heeren 17, the Lord 17 who had governed the company through its long history, found themselves presiding over a dissolution they could neither prevent nor openly acknowledge until the end was upon them. It was acknowledged in the end with the formal expiration of the VOC's charter on the last day of the last year of the 18th century, the 31st of December 1799. After 197 years, the Vereenigde Oostindische Compagnie ceased to exist as a legal entity. Its debts, enormous, far in excess of its assets, were assumed by the Dutch state, which by that point had reconstituted itself under the pressure of the French Revolutionary Wars as the Batavian Republic. Its territories, the vast, sprawling, hard-won arc of forts and factories and islands and trading posts from the Cape to Nagasaki, passed to the state as well and became the foundation of what would eventually be known as the Dutch East Indies, the colonial empire that would persist under various forms of Dutch governance until the middle of the 20th century. The company that had invented the Joint Stock Corporation, that had created the world's first publicly traded shares and watched the world's first stock market grow up around them, that had paid the world's first regular dividends, that had held Japan open to the West through a fan-shaped island in Nagasaki Harbor and planted the seed of Cape Town on the southern tip of Africa, ended not with a dramatic collapse, not with a single catastrophic moment, but with the quiet expiration of a charter that nobody had the ability or the will to renew. Among the people who worked for the VOC in its later years, there circulated a sardonic gloss on its initials. The company's full name, the Vereenigde Oostindische Compagnie, contracted naturally to VOC. But by the 18th century, some were reading those same 3 letters differently. Vergaan onder corruptie, perished under corruption. It was a pun, a retrospective joke, the kind of bitter wordplay that people reach for when they want to name something true that official language cannot quite accommodate. It was not the company's real name, but it captured something real about its ending. And here is what is worth holding in the long dark of this particular night, as the story settles into stillness. The VOC was not one thing. That is the truth that its full story keeps insisting on, the truth that its balance sheets and its massacre records and its surviving share certificates and its lonely little island in Nagasaki Harbor all testify to in different registers. It was a financial invention of extraordinary and lasting consequence, the permanent joint stock corporation, the publicly tradable share, the regulated exchange, the concept of the dividend paid at intervals to dispersed investors who had no direct role in management. These were genuine innovations, tools that reshaped the relationship between capital and enterprise, and that the world has not stopped using in evolved forms. In the 4 centuries since a piece of paper was issued in Enkhuizen on the 9th of September 1606 to a man named Pieter Harmensz. That paper, the oldest share in the world still known to exist, is the document from which an unbroken line runs to every share, traded on every exchange open at this moment somewhere in the world. Every pension fund, every index, every ordinary person who has ever owned a fraction of a company without knowing how to make what that company makes, all of it descends in a real architectural sense from the instrument the VOC created. And the same company, through the same decades in the service of the same commercial logic, emptied islands. It cut down forests to keep prices high. It sent an army of Japanese mercenaries to behead men on a beach so that the nutmeg supply would remain uncontested. It turned a city built on tropical canals into a graveyard of the Europeans it employed and the Asian populations it governed. It held 1 million people in the gradual tightening of a monopoly enforced by cannon and by the deliberate destruction of the means of production wherever those means escaped its control. These are not two separate stories about two different institutions that happen to share a name. They are the same story, told from two different positions. The shareholder in Amsterdam, holding his aandeel and collecting his dividend, first in mace, later in silver, and the Bandanese or Enkhuizen, watching Japanese soldiers advance across his island. They were connected by the same company, the same charter, the same network of commercial logic that turned nutmeg into money and money into power, and power into the freedom to use violence in the service of more money. The financial innovation and the human cost were not coincidences that happened near each other. They were expressions of the same thing. This is what the VOC was, not the world's first multinational in any simple, celebratory sense. Not a straightforward villain either, though it was capable of villainy of a scope that should not be made comfortable. It was something more complicated and more honest than either of those framings. The first institution in which the full ambition and the full destructiveness of organized commercial enterprise were given sovereign powers and an ocean to operate in. And the result was exactly what you might expect when a company is allowed to be a country, when the logic of the ledger is given an army and a fleet and the right to make its own laws in the places where it chooses to do business. The company is gone. It has been gone for more than 2 centuries. But the tools it invented are still here, refined and repackaged and made vastly more efficient, powering a global economy that moves at speeds the Heron 17 could not have imagined, and at scales that would have struck them as impossible. And the territories it built, the islands and the coastlines and the ports and the plantation systems, and the colonial structures that it planted across the arc from the Cape to Nagasaki, those persisted long after the company's dissolution, carrying the shapes of its ambitions into histories that are still being lived and contested and reckoned with by the people who inhabit them. The fort at Batavia became the heart of a colonial capital. The resupply station at the Cape became a country. The cinnamon monopoly in Ceylon became a colonial relationship that lasted until 1948. The Nutmeg Islands of the Banda Archipelago, depopulated and replanted and worked by enslaved hands, grew into something that would take generations to even begin to recover. The single guarded bridge connecting Dejima to Nagasaki was eventually removed, and the island itself was eventually absorbed back into the city around it. But the 2 centuries of Dutch learning that had crossed that bridge left traces in Japanese science and medicine and thought that scholars are still tracing. None of that was planned by anyone. None of it was written into the Charter of 20 March 1602. It was the cumulative consequence of a particular set of commercial incentives pursued with extraordinary competence and extraordinary ruthlessness over nearly 2 centuries by an institution that had been given the tools of sovereignty and the mandate of profit and left to operate at a distance too great for any effective oversight. The arc of the VOC stretches from that morning in 1602 when the States General signed the Charter to that last day of 1799 when the Charter expired and the debts came due and the company dissolved into the state it had once, in some ways, resembled. Between those 2 dates, it had been a thing of genuine wonder and genuine horror, sometimes in the same act, sometimes in the same ledger entry, always in the same restless, ocean-spanning, world-altering project. Rest with that for a moment. Let the scale of it settle, not as an abstraction, not as a set of impressive numbers, but as a texture of the world. Somewhere in a Nagasaki museum there are objects that passed through the guarded bridge at Dejima. Somewhere in the archives of what used to be the Enkhuizen chamber of the VOC, there is a record of Pieter Harmensz and his Deal. Somewhere beneath the streets of modern Jakarta, there are traces of the canals that the VOC built in the image of Amsterdam and that the tropics turned into fever trenches. The company is gone, but it left its shape in the world, pressed into the ground and the water and the legal structures and the financial instruments and the shorelines of half the earth. That is enough explaining for one night. The routes are closed, the ships are still. The Heron 17 have gone to whatever quiet place old lords go when their company has finally dissolved. The nutmeg groves rest in the dark of the Banda Islands, and the fan-shaped island in Nagasaki Harbour is invisible in the night water, and at the Cape the wind is doing what the wind at the Cape always does, indifferent to everything the company built and lost and left behind. That's enough explaining for one night. Rest now.